Hello everyone, this is a video that I've been wanting to do for a very long time now, talking about all of the D&D campaigns that I've ever run in my life and the different lessons and experiences that I gained from them. Now, unfortunately, this is also a video that I've had some difficulty putting together. It's a case in which the way that I imagined it in my head just was not panning out when I went to actually put the thing together. And I went back and forth with different ideas and really gave it a lot of thought. And in the end, I'm going to go with a narration style, if you want to call it a semi-podcast style. I think that's going to work. I've got a lot of notes, but I'm also just going to be speaking off the cuff, off the top of my head, because this is a huge topic for me. Also, thank you very much for your patience. I'm sorry about the delay. Since the last video that I put out, it's been a little while. I've still been doing the live streaming stuff, but I've been dedicating a lot of my time to working on my upcoming book, Esper's Emporium of Esoterica, which, on that note, the pre-order store is now open. So I'll go ahead and put a link down below the video in the description. Check that out if you want to get your copy on pre-order for either the PDF or the hardback. So, D&D campaigns. It's a bit difficult to know where to start the tale of my path as a DM. From my very youngest days, I was already a storyteller. I was a monster drawer, a leader of adventures with my groups of friends and family. But we have to start somewhere. I can't just start, when I'm like 2 years old. So let's begin in my pre-Dungeons and Dragons days with Hero Quest. It's more of an adventure board game or a simple war game, but it captured my imagination and it made me wonder what else this kind of tabletop game could expand into. I noticed early on, as I'm sure everyone does when you get to playing games like this, that players can really gripe a lot and argue with each other. And they can argue with the game master and argue about the rules. But Hero Quest sort of got me hooked on the tabletop role-playing game type experience. Next was Earth Dawn, and I don't remember too much about this. I attempted to play Earth Dawn. I picked it up at a comic book store / gaming store when I was, say, 14 or 15 years old. I realized quickly that trying to figure out a whole RPG system by yourself from the book can be complicated and overwhelming. Of course, back then, didn't really have the resources on the internet like we have nowadays, so I do think it's easier now with the benefit of all sorts of sites and resources and tutorials to teach yourself. But really still, it is better if you can find other people that have some experience and join in with them and just learn by playing the game. The next RPG was my own creation called Weapon Cyborg, and I did this during 8th grade. It was something like a mix between Star Wars and 90s Marvel comics. It was a world-spanning pulp sci-fi fantasy adventure system, very light on rules, very high on storytelling. During the 8th grade year, where pretty much every guy in my class had played my Weapon Cyborg game, and a number of them played it regularly. This was fantastic for me because you may not know this, but I suffered terrible amounts of bullying during school, and now suddenly I was sort of the leader, cool, popular kid, at least for a little moment. It probably didn't last for too long. I also discovered how interesting and fun and captivating it can be to play an RPG. It's really different than a video game in which you're limited by what's been programmed into it, and video games are not quite a full RPG. Most often they're more sort of like an fantasy action game or a war game type experience. I also realized with this Weapon Cyborg game is that I've got some kind of talent here for creating worlds, characters, stories, for making up these adventures that people really enjoy. So that was an amazing experience for me. Next comes Luna Drift, a campaign of mine from the earlier 2000s. featuring Legendscape, technically Legendscape version 3. This was a system that I had developed out of a mod that I'd made to Hero Quest. So it grew out of Hero Quest. By version 3, it was really its own game. It was something halfway between a board game and an actual RPG system. It was still a somewhat simple game, but my friends and I had great fun playing it. The campaign was about a fantasy world at the beginning of a new era, building a grand new city, but lo and behold, there are evil demons of old below the surface world. It's something about having a continuing storyline that spans for many months I found was a really awesome thing. It's really cool to be a part of that. It takes a lot of work and effort and a degree of focused attention, but if everyone really gets into the game, it develops a momentum of its own, and that momentum really ends up driving things forward. I learned as well that once you reach the limits of a game system, you kind of see the edge of the world. You realize that something which once felt so vast actually has its boundaries, and you begin to chafe a bit at those limitations. It's as though you're getting too big for your shell, and you begin to wish and wonder about a bigger design space and more possibilities. The Ashblades was my next campaign. It continued with that same fantasy world, officially called Esperia. I know. A new king gathers an army filled with ranks of fiend-blooded soldiers, and an underground resistance group is led by the Ashblades, warriors and mages of good. After my contact with playing actual D&D, my perspective grew by leaps and bounds. My simple Legendscape system ended up morphing into a bigger, deeper system. At the same time, it was also this freakish monstrosity that was clunky and inconsistent. I learned that it's easy to let your inspiration take over and put the cart before the horse. You start creating all these things before you even understand how to develop solid game mechanics. Yes, we had fun, and the stories and the characters were great, but the unstable Frankenstein of a system was just doomed to collapse. The Blackhearts came next. The characters in this campaign were a dark sect with shadowy, clandestine plots. I learned that it can be fun to play anti-heroes and evil characters from time to time. I was able to develop Legendscape into version 5 by this point. It was a bit tighter, clearer, more consistent, but it was still full of bugs and a lot of limitations. Apparently, a 23-year-old kid can't create a better RPG system than teams of professional game designers with decades of development under their belts. The epic campaign, because I can't remember what the name of the damn campaign was. Fantastical Adventures in Esperia. Oops, we accidentally gave an evil artifact to a pit fiend, and now he's invading the world with devils, enslaved evil dwarves whose ruins we explored way back in that first Legendscape campaign, and constructs and war machines that they've been inventing all this time. At the time, I called this Legendscape version 6, but looking back, it really was just a big mod of 3.5 D&D, kind of like a Pathfinder before there was Pathfinder. The system was so much better being based on 3.5 D&D. I learned as well that running a massive campaign that spans all the levels of play from 1 to 20 is a huge undertaking, and it requires a lot of passion and a lot of work. But wow, the memories will stay with you forever. You really feel like you have walked in the footsteps of the legendary heroes of myth. Then came a short campaign of mine called Serpent's Isle. The characters are captives imprisoned in a goblin stronghold. They manage to escape, but then their ship crash lands on a tropical island filled with dinosaurs, monsters, and tribal folk. This was my first campaign that I DM'd, which was pure D&D, no mods. One player was a fantastic role player, another was a mega geek with a million splat books, and the other two were just there to hang out. I learned that this mega geek type player will comb through his million splat books, and he will read a million internet build posts to come up with some kind of freakazoid power character. As a DM, this will be a bit overwhelming. You have two main options. A, just ban it and tell the player to stick with the core books. Or B, hang on to the handlebars. The ride is about to get crazy, and just do your best to go with the wacky flow. I chose option B, and I still do to this day. In order for a campaign to really last, I figured out that it really requires a couple things. The DM needs to be telling a really good story with good adventures, and the players need to actually want to be there. They have to be into it. Without both sides contributing value and getting invested, the campaign eventually is just going to sputter out or crash and burn. The following campaign was Ruins of Asperia. The epic war from that previous epic campaign has ended with glorious victory. Now we are exploring and building a new nation on a neighboring continent. Wow, it's full of wonders and monsters and strange old cultures. I really learned in this campaign how cool it can be to take published adventures and convert them for use into your own custom world. I also found that it's just so wonderful to have a player in your group who is both a good friend and a great role player that really gets in character. And you're gonna miss this player so much once he can't play anymore. Dark Moon came next. It was adventures in a cold northern land, sometimes mythic, sometimes scary horror fantasy. It spanned many different adventures and then ended in a TPK against a fang dragon. My first campaign to ever end that way. I learned that you can spend hours crafting an awesome villain NPC, only for her to die on the first round of combat to a high-level spell. It sucks. But you can also secretly reskin that monster and use it shortly after, and the players probably aren't going to know. It's going to be your own little secret, and your time and effort will not have been wasted. Everseed. This campaign was in the closing phase of the 3.5 system. It began with the characters captive and without gear. They got tossed into a massive sacrificial pit along with NPCs. They survived the fall and ended up in the Underdark with these 3 NPCs, including one who had contracted the slimy doom disease. It was a hardcore Underdark survival campaign, ending with them recovering a seed of earth power, returning it to the Temple of Winds over a drought-racked nation, and restoring balance and fertility to the land. It was my first survival-type campaign, and also my first campaign in which the environment really posed a lot of limitations. There were always lamentations from the players that it was gruelingly difficult, and they had such little access to resources and NPCs, but we all loved it. It was a campaign that really had so much tone and atmosphere and a lot of tension. And the victory at the end was just so sweet. I learned that there is a very fine line between amazing epic struggles and overwhelming difficulty. I also learned that freaky aberrations in the lightless caverns below the world are very effective at creating mood and tension. Bane of Verland / Heroes of Verland was a massive 3-year-long spanning campaign. It began the day 4E was released, and it lasted this whole time, spanning from levels 1 to 30. Began with the characters as part of an order of the lawful evil god Bane. Then they saved the nation from a demon / undead horde, and it went all the way to their tragic downfall as they themselves were ultimately a corrupt faction. Then it transitioned into the Heroes of Verland section somewhere around the middle of the campaign, which was the surviving characters' redemption. They transformed into heroes of good, and it culminated in extraplanar adventures and a final showdown against Orcus. So running a campaign of this scope is like running a series of marathons. It's such a huge undertaking, especially at high levels, which get pretty complicated to create. The very high levels of play are just crazy. You have to change your mindset to make it work. It's no longer heroes of the land, it's extraplanar super champions, demon lords, and gods. I learned that as a DM, you need to have a good understanding of how you handle character death, and you need to communicate that to the players as much in advance as possible. I've had many character deaths over the years, but this was the only time that it felt wrong. I felt like I didn't properly explain what was at risk and the alternate mechanics that I was using at a certain scene. That was when the mid-level characters went into a mass combat battle sequence and the ending of the Bane of Verlin segment before the transition to the Heroes of Verlin. Throughout those 3 years, I found that the 4E system becomes a mechanical slog once you play it enough. But despite the shortcomings of 4E, it still had some really cool things going on with it. And in the end, it's your own stories and your own characters that give life to the game. Vernal Dawn was a simultaneous campaign to Bane of Verlin. It also began the day the 4E books hit the shelves. You might have noticed now my trend of running multiple concurrent campaigns. The campaign started off cool, but its storyline kind of faltered and the players' styles didn't always mix so well. Particularly, there was one player who was very much into role-playing and intrigue, which I also like, but the rest of the group didn't know exactly what to do with that, and the 4E system didn't always lend so well to it. Combined with a couple of players leaving and new ones joining and a couple character deaths that ended the main plot hooks, the campaign just couldn't endure. That said, we did make it a good 5 or 6 months along, and there was even a really interesting crossover session in which the parties from both of the different groups fought each other in a big arena combat tournament. The Adventurers Guild was a new type of campaign for my friends and I. In this style, each adventure, a different person took their turn as the DM, so we were always rotating who was DMing, and everyone got a chance to both DM and play a character for quite a bit. To this day, this campaign accounts for the longest amount of time that I have ever gotten to play a character in D&D. It was a fairly sandbox type campaign. Each new adventure was really its own self-contained module. Some of them really were just only one-shots. While it lacked in the cohesive, overarching story of a traditional campaign, it also allowed us the freedom to explore a variety of different adventures and characters. And actually, 2 of my biggest adventures from the campaign, Wormrock and Dreadmire, went on to become big hits with my group, and we still tell stories about them from time to time. Next came Mystic Realms. This was my final 4E campaign, and also the last campaign that I ran in my Esperia setting. It began with a deep personal look into the characters, who were born and raised in a small town near a forest in a marshland. It was one of the more unique storylines that I had crafted. It mainly dealt with the Feywild and the material plane, and some mix-ups and crossovers that happened in the aftermath of that demonic war from the epic Bane of Verlin / Heroes of Verlin campaign. The characters had many personal moments. I made some really interesting NPCs, and there was a big adventure arc in which the characters were in a massive mystical labyrinth in the Feywild. Unfortunately, a series of player issues led to the demise of the campaign. My girlfriend, who was a player in the campaign, and I had a bad breakup. A good friend who was a player suddenly had a falling out with me. Another friend was constantly complaining while he was playing. It wasn't really the best ending ever, but the good parts of the campaign were really good. I learned a number of different things from this campaign. One thing was that I had a player who made a warlock character who had a kind of curse, and this curse also provided the character his power. And there was no clear plan for how the character's power was going to be just as good, if not better, once he was freed from the curse. There was also no clear understanding of what the real drawback of the curse was, other than the character being a sort of dark, brooding, festering evil guy. So this caused a situation where the player had very, very little incentive to resolve the curse. And this player especially had some power gamer inclinations, so it really led to a breakdown of the game's narrative, because you would think the character would want to get freed from this affliction, but the player actually didn't want that. And this also led into the next point, is that sometimes you get a player who doesn't understand the concept of creating a character that is cohesive along with the other characters and with your setting and with the storyline. So he's out of place, and frequently it causes tone clashes. This is like a toxin in your campaign's bloodstream. It's really important to talk about these things before the campaign starts, when everyone is still just developing their ideas. Another thing that I discovered is sometimes you're going to have a player who criticizes you a lot. Now, some amount of constructive criticism can be very helpful, for sure. But if you have gripers, complainers, and essentially players who just sit there and make flippant remarks, your affinity for the group and for the game is going to drop. So after 5 years of playing 4th edition heavily, I couldn't take it anymore. I was burnt out on the system, and to some degree, I was burnt out on D&D. Well into the next year, there were many new things. I had the D&D Next playtest document, I was in a different relationship, I'd made a number of life changes that had really put me onto a different path in many ways. So I did a few adventures. I wrote them using the D&D 5e playtest rules, such as King of the Sunken Pyramid and Beneath the Crimson Citadel. I was really enjoying the new system, and it had this ability to rekindle a feeling inside of me, something that I hadn't felt since back in the 3rd edition days. The adventures were cool, my friends and I had fun, but ultimately I was still dealing with too many life issues to hold down a long-lasting campaign. My next stab at a 5e campaign was Sons of the Solstice. It was a really loose campaign that was highly improvisational in nature, and it explored my new Novara setting. If you've ever watched my old D&D narrated adventures here on YouTube, things like Tomb of Blacktongue and A Star Above the Changing Winds, that is a region of Novara, and that was the tone of this campaign. It was a mix of D&D pulp and gritty historical fantasy. The issue was that I just really wasn't into this campaign. Partially, it was that I had just gone through yet another terrible breakup. Partially, it was that the group that I was with, I just wasn't really feeling the vibe and the dynamics, and partly I was still kind of burned out with D&D. I learned that a DM has to really be engaged and passionate about the campaign for it to be great and to last a long time. Another issue still was that more and more I was realizing that my Novara setting worked better for my short stories and novels, and sometimes D&D kind of clashed with it in tone. Also, I was at a point that I, myself, in real life, needed some adventure. I needed to grow. I needed to learn, to expand, to travel and explore. I needed something more to draw upon in order to bring stories and worlds to life. And travel I did, which gave me a lot of new experiences, new challenges, and new inspiration. This brings me to City of Mazes. Towards the end of my second stay in Brazil, I had a particularly mysterious experience, and through this I reconnected with my love of ultra-high fantasy. Shortly after arriving back in the US, I started developing a new setting called Ikoria, which still resonated with my love of storytelling and history and mythology, and at the same time, it would accommodate and even embrace the super high magic, everything goes style of fantasy that D&D has. City of Mazes began centered around Bazagon, a giant island metropolis that drew inspiration from D&D mega dungeons, gladiatorial Rome, Ravnica City of Guilds from Magic, and even a bit of Mortal Kombat. It eventually expanded into a whole world and a massive, long-running storyline. It did end up with a TPK, except for one character, Anji, who was sort of the most primary protagonist of the campaign. he somehow miraculously escaped that. I learned so much from this campaign, including many ways to be a better DM. Things like easing off of trying to micromanage everything and focusing more on helping the players execute their creative ideas. Or instead of always worrying that this or that option was quote-unquote overpowered, I would just channel my time and my effort into creating interesting NPCs and an intriguing setting and dynamic challenges. I learned so much about the 5e system, and as much as I critique it a lot on my channel here, I really fell in love with 5e. And my criticisms actually are because I want the best for it. I want it to be even better. Yes, at times 5e can be a generic hodgepodge, and there are certain mechanical spaces where you run into limitations sooner than you would like to. But overall, it's a very smooth, fast-flowing system that's built on a stable foundation, and it's very easy to mod. I also learned, yet again, how important it is to game with the right people. Those who get along well, who are into the campaign, people who vibe more or less off of the same tone. I, in my group, also learned that it is a very bad idea to insult and disrespect an order of high-level wizards within their own stronghold. The land of dreams and nightmares. Just a few months after the highly successful start of City of Mazes, I launched my livestream Patrons campaign, which took place in a different part of Ikoria, bearing a very different main plot. It centered around the Stormbringers, a gritty band of ambitious adventurers fueled primarily by Captain Noxaqual and Lycar Telvantis. Nox with his drive to recover all the scattered pieces of the Masked One, his Shadow Lord patron, and Lycar with his mysterious connection to a deceased Storm Titan. There was also a realm main plot of the Myrrh Queen and her blights and curses that racked the land, along with her rallying an undead army from beyond the borders of civilization. It was an amazing campaign, full of great role-playing, interesting characters, tons of tense story moments, and epic battles. In the end, there were tragic downfalls of the characters, and it concluded on a bittersweet note of a hard-won last stand, yet with a looming threat encroaching over the land. I learned so much from this campaign as well. I learned a lot about creating monsters and aiming for that sweet spot where you balance clarity and ease of use with the monster's dynamics and uniqueness and a little bit of complexity. Another thing I really liked was building up a setting and a storyline such that the characters can drive things forward. I remember several moments that I greatly enjoyed watching the players debate their decisions and have these in-depth discussions with each other and really proactively incite the forward motion of the story and the action. And then I, the DM, got to respond and react and otherwise enjoy the surprise of things unfolding before me as well. Truly, the journey is the reward. Curse of Strahd. This is actually the only official D&D module that I've run to date, the only published campaign that I've ever run as of now. I've run tons of standalone adventures over the years, but never the full-on campaign in a published setting. I guess my creator, artist soul just likes to create original settings. That said, the 5e Ravenloft book opened my mind, and it inspired me to want to run another published campaign at some point. Curse of Strahd has great atmosphere, a cool setting, some really interesting NPCs, and a tone that feels both classic and modern all at once. My group and I did enjoy it, and I even found a way to weave it into my Ikoria setting. But I found certain aspects of the book to be clunky. They didn't quite flow, they didn't have quite enough organization for me. Also, Castle Ravenloft is a series of 2.5D isometric maps, which look cool aesthetically on the page, but they aren't the best for practical purposes. If you, like many DMs, draw out battle maps on a grid, and your group cares about the fine details of the tactical combat, it's kind of a bitch to run. Also, the story has a few plot holes which were a little odd. For one, Strahd is nearly a god in his realm, and he could easily just kill the characters from the beginning. The book says that he's bored with existence and he savors toying with the characters for his own amusement, so he'll attack and he'll harry them, but he won't actually kill them till the final showdown at his castle. Yet, in the same breath, the module tells us that Strahd is madly in love with Irina Kalyana, who is the reincarnation of his long-deceased true love Tatiana, thus giving him an extremely powerful reason to want to live and to be invested, and to eradicate those pesky third-level adventurers who threaten to mess up the primary motivation for his existence. It's also weird that the characters get access to Irina pretty much right from the start. She could just die in a random encounter with wolves as you're traveling, or an evil character could just try to kill her. I'll stop there before I go on a big Curse of Strahd tangent. Age of Requiem. This is part 2 of the City of Mazes campaign. This one picked up a couple years after the events of the prior campaign, and in effect for us, merely just composed one long campaign because the two halves were seamless. So Anji, who had survived the prior campaign by just the skin of his teeth, gathered a new group of champions and joined the world-scale war of two opposing mega alliances, the enemies in this case being two powerful factions from Bazagon siding with Geryon the Archdevil and his infernal army. I learned to an even greater degree how mind-blowing the final few levels of D&D are. Epic, insane, ridiculous, unbelievable, that just barely approaches it. Especially if the characters have a number of magic items at their disposal, which they usually do by that level. They can handle about anything. They just have so many options and resources and powers at their disposal. Just look at this. Within one stretch, the party fought the Archdevil Geryon, an advanced version of him, along with the Archdevil Moloch, a pit fiend, 2 ice devils, 2 Arrhenius infernal priestesses, 2 regular Arrheniuses, a Duergar despot, a Bone Devil warlock, 3 normal Bone Devils, 2 tiefling warlocks, 14 minotaurs summoned from Geryon's horn, 8 Maragons, 1 geomancer, which is kind of Duergar wizard, 25 bearded devils, a Duergar war chanter, a kind of bard, 6 imps, 70 Duergars, a stun symbol spell at the front gate, and a pain symbol spell at the entrance of Geryon's throne room. This was unbelievable. That was a very long fight, and it was quite dangerous and threatening, and there were a couple kind of scary moments, but I don't think there was ever a time where it felt desperate. And then, the final encounter of the campaign was against the Tarask and an ancient red dragon at the same time, and they stomped the monsters without mercy. Overall, this was such a fulfilling campaign. It developed a bunch of our own lore. It had really amazing story moments, such as the reincarnations of gods and the ascension of the characters to being exarchs and high kings and the emperor. It essentially resolved the main world conflict of the Ikoria setting, and it gave us such a sense of accomplishment. After the Mists, this is a sandbox-type campaign that follows the personal stories of the characters. They're in a large continent in the aftermath of the supernatural war from the prior campaign. It's my first attempt at a pro DM game, and the players bring a variety of different play styles. The campaign's currently active. We're having a great time. I'm finding that DMing 3 campaigns really is a lot to take on at one time. I've also discovered with this group that there can be certain challenges when you have players of such different play styles all coming together. But if you use a lot of communication and patience and a dose of good humor, things can really end up coming together. I'm also learning about the different approaches to DMing. Sandbox versus railroad, improvisation versus pre-written, leading with character stories versus leading with the DM story, heavy role-playing versus dungeon crawling, and so forth. Whatever way you choose, there's going to be pros and cons. At the heart of it all, The three main friends from my City of Mazes / Age of Requiem campaigns have been joined by two newcomers in this new current campaign of ours. It began in the Underdark at level 1, mostly gearless, with the characters crawling out of the mouth of the Tarask that prior 20th level adventurers had driven back into the bowels of the earth. It harkens somewhat back to my old Everseed campaign, and it features elements of survival, Lovecraftian horror, psychological horror, and strange magic. There are Grimlocks and Drow factions, along with aberrations, and the characters trying to reach the surface again, where they can then go to play out their characters' personal stories that they've been brewing on since Session 0. I'm also playtesting some material for my upcoming 5e book, so there is a lot for me to learn with that. I'm also learning about more ways in which monsters can mess with the characters, beyond simply attacking them like highway marauders. With a bit of sadistic creativity, monsters and villains can sometimes really manipulate the characters to achieve deeper and farther-reaching effects. Mirror Morn. After the Land of Dreams and Nightmares, I was ready for something different. I went back to the drawing board to create a new setting. This one's called Mirror Morn, which takes some different approaches to the D&D tropes, and it features a very different setting full of unique terrain, flora, and fauna. That's right, there are no generic forests with wolves or grasslands with horses. There are giant mushroom forests, tangles of jellyfish turned fungus turned stone, a sea of lava, plains where the grass is so tall and thick it's like weaving through the corridors of a labyrinth. The animals are alien, fantastical, or as though from some isolated prehistoric corner. The NPCs are odd and eccentric, and yet everything, despite its exoticness, has human emotion at its core. I'm drawing on such inspirations as Morrowind and the Shivering Isles from Elder Scrolls, novels by authors such as Mervyn Peake and Neil Gaiman, and film directors such as Ridley Scott, Tim Burton, and David Lynch, as well as a dose of heavy metal in there for good measure. One clear thing that I'm getting from this campaign is that it is a breath of fresh air to try out a new and exotic setting after playing standard D&D for so long, and beyond just D&D, I'm talking about the standard fantasy genre with all of its stereotypes and tropes. There's nothing wrong with them at all, but after so many years of being immersed in that, it's just a new spark to have this novel setting. It's imaginative, it's weird at times, and yet it always comes back to a classic feeling in the tradition of the Romantic era and time-honored fairy tales. I'm also continuing to learn more about utilizing player-driven character stories. There's something I'm trying to figure out about that. In my olden days, I always just focused on my own story, on my DM-created main world plotline, and the characters needed to just find their own ways to connect with it. While there's nothing inherently wrong or bad about that approach, not at all, I'm enjoying exploring the ideas and the themes that the players are coming up with. I hope I'll be able to collect my thoughts better on this topic in the near future and to be able to better talk about and express what I'm trying to get at with this subject. Looking back, I've been very fortunate to have played so much D&D across so many campaigns, each one spanning tons of adventures. On top of this, there are the many one-shot adventures that I've run, as well as the YouTube narrated adventures. Every new campaign is something of an experiment, and I learn from it, and I grow into hopefully a better DM and a better world builder and storyteller. That's one of my main takeaways, is just to stick with it. Keep going, and you'll keep improving. If you're not satisfied with your D&D game currently, make some changes. Talk to the others, try something new, and probably, most importantly, let go of your bad habits that are holding you back. The other main takeaway is that if you can create a good D&D game, the memories will last forever. You'll be able to reminisce and retell the tales with your friends. Truly, you will have undertaken adventures and delves into a world that is so far away and unreal, yet at the same time, it's so close that it lives inside of you, and it is as real as anything else. My great dream is to give inspiration and creative encouragement to the world, such that many others can also take part in this kind of wondrous experience. And that is why I wish for you now, as I always will, may your adventures be many.